questions like, was there a worldwide flood? Is the Bible's account of the flood legitimate, worldwide, or does it speak about a local event? And some people would claim that the Genesis account is exaggerating things. So here's an interesting statement. A Manitoba geologist, he says that they found scientific proof, and this was in the National Post, by the way, of the flood described in the biblical story of Noah and his ark. And then he goes on and says, this isn't 40 days and 40 nights of rain, as the scriptures would describe Noah's flood, but it's certainly one that would have impacted on people and their settlements. And notice how he ends it. It's the product of the great melt at the end of the last ice age. By the way, we believe, and we're probably, climatologists cannot explain the origin of ice ages. We believe that the ice age followed the flood. Notice he's saying here, the flood followed the ice age. He's saying the exact opposite. So, what we're going to do is review some evidence for the biblical flood, not the result of the ice age, but the other way around. But I'm not going to address the question of the search for Noah's Ark. Here's an interesting article. That's the entire article, by the way. The whole article says researchers challenge the story of Noah's Ark in the Globe and Mail. So we had an article from the National Post. Here's one in the Globe and Mail. And there's not a stitch of evidence in this article. That's the whole article. Then why is it so fashionable to challenge the Bible? Well, somebody would say, fake news. But here's another one. Others claim that the Bible reports a local flood in the Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean area. And it was for instance, one suggestion is when an ice dam broke, all the water came rushing in and flooded the Middle East. And that's what the Genesis account is. Here's one from ABC News. Again, the local flood in the Black Sea. Why do they continue publishing these articles if they think that Genesis is a myth? Well, they want to discredit the Bible. That's what they're trying to do. So why do people challenge the Genesis flood? They don't like it as an explanation for a worldwide sediment layers. They don't like that. They don't like it because if the Genesis flood produced the sediment, then there's no evolution going on. And the mass extinctions that we see, particularly of dino bones, are best explained by the flood. And so they again want to reject the flood. So they think that a local flood is a compromise so that you can say, well, Genesis is really just talking about a local flood. And another reason why they challenge is that they love to try to find ammunition to undermine the Bible. And so if we can't believe the Genesis flood of the account, what can we believe in Scripture? Various extinctions are claimed to have occurred in the fossil record, and these are usually the primary ones, with the dinos going extinct 65 million years ago. So here's one of the possible causes: volcanoes. Here, they also talk about asteroids or comets, global cooling or global warming. But which one do they never include? The flood. Never will they suggest that it was a flood. Here's an interesting one. Notice the date, January the 16th, 2020, and this is in Science Daily. And they said, in the death of dinos, it was all about asteroids, not volcanoes. January 16th. 2 days later, The Economist says it was toxic climate-changing gases from volcanic eruptions. So one popular media says it's asteroids. The other said it's volcanoes. 2 days apart. Simply, they're clueless. They can't get their story straight. So where did all the water come from that was in the flood. Anybody want to suggest where all this water came from? Because it covered at the pre-flood mountains to 15 cubits. This is a cubit. 15 cubits above the top of the pre-flood mountains. Where'd all that water come from? It came out of the ground? Is that what you said? Huh? So, according to what Genesis tells us, the waters prevailed so mighty over the earth that the high mountains were covered to 15 cubits. And here's what we're told. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were open. Our geologists, creation from our organization, but also for the Institute of Creation Research, they believe that at the time of the flood, they estimate that at the time of the flood, there were 25,000 volcanoes erupted, spewing out hot water, vapor, that goes up and hits the atmosphere, and then it comes down as acidic rain. And so the great fountains of the deep, bursting forth all of this water that was stored underground and came out and flooded the land. Here's an interesting one. This was just a few weeks ago in August. Tonga eruption sent enough water, this is one volcano, to fill 58,000 Olympic pools. That amount of water was put into the atmosphere, one volcano. It's estimated that there's still 50,000 cubic kilometers of fresh water underneath the ocean floors. So a lot of water came gushing out, and there's still a lot of water because we see it coming up in volcanoes. So what are some of the facts that support the biblical record of the flood? Mass extinctions. The evolutionists cannot explain how using tsunamis or river deltas or avalanches or local floods can explain mass extinctions. Worldwide sediment layers. If you align Brazil and Africa together, the sediment layers on the original continent that God had created during the flood, the sediment layers were laid down in that area. When God was tearing the continent apart to create the new ocean basins, the continents were separating rapidly, and now we see the sediment layers that went across. There's also sediment layers that go out from eastern Canada across Greenland and then into the United Kingdom and then into Europe, because at one time they were all adjacent in the original continent. The Grand Canyon was not formed by the Colorado River. The Grand Canyon was still, the sediment layers had been laid down over the year of the flood, and they were still soft. And as the water is starting to rush into the new forming ocean basins, they carve out massive amounts of sediment, and then the Colorado River follows the path of least resistance. Now, we have an interesting laboratory example of how this sediment can be laid down extremely rapidly. The volcano at Mount St. Helens in 1980, it melted all of the ice cap or the snow cap, and also a lot of vapor came out and came down as running down the mountain and causing a lot of erosion. And it laid down sediment within the matter of hours. And you notice it looks just like what you'd see in a canyon. And that rock was forming into rock within 5 years. That sediment that had been laid down. So we have a little laboratory example that we witnessed, and the sediment was laid down very similar to what is in like the Grand Canyon. There's serpentine-shaped rocks that are thinned and stretched. When the sediment was still soft and hadn't yet hardened into rock, this makes sense. If it already hardened into rock, it's just going to crumble. And there, in the Grand Canyon, you can actually see some of the stretching and thinning of the layers as the fault lines are adjusting. We have examples of what's called rapid sediment deposition, ripple marks and rain marks and footprints, and that the next layer of sediment had to have been laid down gently and immediately to preserve that. And I don't know if I have both copies left, but I have two different books out there. One, How Genesis Flood Shaped Our Earth, and the other is Biblical Geology 101. And they explain the method whereby the sediment can be laid down rapidly on top, layers on top. There's the absence of erosion and a lack of soil layer. In the Grand Canyon, the layers are razor thin, and if they had been laid down millions of years apart, there should be all kinds of erosion and soil formation, but there isn't. Here's an interesting one. The article in Science Daily said, how were the fossil tracks made by early Triassic swimming reptiles so well preserved? They don't have an explanation, but we do because of the sediment layers being laid down on top of one another. And as the animals are fleeing from the floodwaters, as they're rising, the interesting thing is the next sediment layer comes in. As they're fleeing inland, the next sediment layer comes in, settles on. Then the current backs off, and they return. And in the third sediment layer, the footprints are there again. So they're not millions of years apart. We're actually seeing them in the subsequent sediment layers. So they say a unique combination of factors in a river delta. No, it doesn't work. The worldwide flood is the best explanation, and I've already said the same tracks in layers. Fossils are not being formed in mass today, and yet they were somewhere in history, massive quantities of fossils, but nobody is observing it today. And so, again, the best explanation is a catastrophe, and the flood is it. Here's an interesting one that was from 2019. A dig is finding fish, mammals, and dinos, a triceratop, all buried together, and they blame it on a tsunami. Well, that's interesting. I'd like to know how fish got over the Rocky Mountains in a tsunami and ended up amongst the dinos. These are what are called out-of-place fossils. They're not an issue for us because the mixing is going on as the water is rising, and so occasionally you're going to have a land animal and a fish mixed into the fossil layer. And the flood is a much better explanation. Tree trunks that run up through multiple sediment layers. You have a coal layer, a shale layer, a sandstone layer. Evolutionists admit that these had to have been laid down rapidly, or the tree trunks would have eroded away. And so the evolutionists respond, and they say, yeah, it's occasionally rapid, but it couldn't have all been buried at the same time. Why not? It occurred across the globe in the flood. But they admit it had to have been rapid sediment layers. And so they must accept rapid sediment deposition, but they're not willing to accept it as, they say, it occurred different times over millions of years. And these are found all over the world. And the best explanation, again, is a rapid sediment deposition going on during the flood. Massive canyons, water gaps, and all of the geologic formations. Again, read how Noah's flood shaped our earth, or Biblical Geology 101. You'll see how these are formed. And the denial of the flood actually leads to a problem because they then misinterpret the evidence that's so clear in front of them. I'm not going to give you a whole presentation on the ice sheet, just a quick few thoughts, but standard models cannot explain ice age. You need warm oceans with a lot of moisture vapor, and you need cool summers, which would have been all the dust and aerosols from the 25,000 volcanoes. When you have warm water and cold air goes across it, you get a lot of moisture sucked up. Buffalo, New York got hit by 5 feet of snow on Thursday because Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, by the way, are much warmer because in that part of Ontario, we were quite warm. We had like 18, we set a record in November for the warmest day ever on that day. So Lake Erie and Lake Ontario had stayed quite warm. And all that cold air dumping massive quantities of snow off of Lake Erie on Buffalo and off of Lake Ontario in western New York, eastern New York, like we're Lake Placid. And so you need warm water mixing from the flood, and you need cool summers, which come from the aerosols and dust, so that all the snow that falls doesn't melt during the summer. And then as the ice recession ends, when the oceans eventually cool down, the best explanation for the ice age is post-flood events. And secular climatologists and geologists cannot explain ice ages. We also have evidence outside of the Bible and geology, the traditions of the ancients. There are over 300 different legends from most cultures. In fact, I have a brand new book that's just been published that has 300 legends from just the North American Aboriginal peoples. And they're all over the world. And they all have similar concepts: a pilot, a floating vessel, and all these things. And at least 60 major groups of these show no evidence of borrowing. As the people were leaving Shinar after the Tower of Babel, they carried with them their knowledge through their ancestors had handed down the knowledge of the flood and of creation, by the way. And so we've done an analysis of the different cultures that around the world that have flood legends and the similarities in them. So I want to just give you one example from the Lenape Algonquins, and they're in, well, it's interesting. We have Algonquin Park in Ontario, but it wasn't Algonquin Indians. They're further south. But they're down in New York and into Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So this is their account. After the rushing waters had subsided, the flood, the turtle, the Lenape-Lape people, were close together in hollow houses, living together. And this is before the Tower of Babel. All the cabin fires of the land became disquieted, volcanoes, and all said to their priests, let us go. Notice the priests, it's a religious thing at the Tower of Babel. To the snake land, to the east they went forth, going away, earnestly grieving, split asunder, weak, trembling. God is driving them out, and they went torn and broken to the snake land, the division of languages. Those of the north agreed, those of the east agreed, over the water, the frozen sea. They went to enjoy it. Over the wonderful slippery sea, on the stone-hard water all went, on the great tidal sea, the mussel-bearing sea. This is during the Ice Age. They're leaving from Shinar. They're traveling across Asia, going down across the Bering Strait and coming down into North America. Those from the west came, so we're going from west to east, came with hesitation, esteeming highly their old home. 10,000 at night, all in one night, to the snake land, to the east. They walk and walk, all of them. And they all come, they tarry at the land of the spruce pines. So now they're into Alaska or British Columbia, the western coast of North America. And then at a place of caves, at last had food on a pleasant plain. So they crossed over the Rockies and the coastal mountains onto the Great Plains. So that's a legend as they cross from west to east and end up going all the way across North America to the East Coast. And yet they talk about the flood and the Great Migration. So in the evolutionary sequences, they have the pre-Archean, the Archean, and all these levels, and they give them dates. But there's no independent way to measure all these dates. So some people say, well, we can use radiometric dating, but it cannot be applied to sedimentary rock. It is applied to igneous rock, volcanic rock. But even if you tried to use igneous rock, here's just two examples. In Hawaii, a volcano that was observed in 1800. Rock samples that were formed in 1800, 12 different samples, have been dated using radiometric data from 140 million years to almost 3 billion years, with an average of 1.41 billion years. We know the rock was formed in 1800, and yet the radiometric data are dating them as very old. Rock from the lava dome of Mount St. Helens exploded in 1980, and yet rock samples were being estimated using radiometric data of 350,000 years. To be blunt, radiometric dating does not work, but they won't accept that. So taking this layer of sediment that's been laid down with the names they give it, there's an interesting discovery of pollen and spores at the Precambrian layer. Anybody know where in Canada there's Precambrian rock? It's the Canadian Shield. So you go over toward Kenora and you reach the Canadian Shield. I worked in Sudbury for 5 years, and we were right in the Canadian Shield. So it is believed by creationist geologists that what happened was that the higher elevations during the flood were scoured away, and the Precambrian rock is the rock that was left after the scouring process, and all the sediment went down into the lower areas. Timothy Clary, a book published by Institute Creation Research called Carved in Stone. He is a geologist who worked in the oil industry for a number of years, and he has access to the database of all the core samples taken around the world. And what he has done is he has analyzed the sediment layers around the world, and he actually explains when they're laid down during the flood. But he makes an interesting comment. He says that the highest elevations that are left now were the ones that were scoured away, and he points to two examples. The Canadian Shield and an area in Brazil are the highest layers left from the pre-flood, and he said the Garden of Eden was probably on the Canadian Shield. And I said, the Garden of Eden was in Sudbury? So it was a funny comment he has in his book. So in the Precambrian layer, below all the sediment, there was discovery of pollen and spores, and yet they weren't supposed to have evolved until the Devonian, and there's a 2 billion year separation here. It's not a problem for creationists. Pollen would get washed in to the lowest level of sediment during the flood, but it's a real problem for evolutionists. Here's an interesting one. Just go into Google and say, type in what I typed in was, when did grass evolve? Just type it in, and this is what comes up, around 55 million years ago. And yet, in the science papers, dinos dined on grass, and yet dinos were supposed to have gone extinct 65 million years ago. And so there's a 10 million year gap here in their thinking. They can't get their thoughts straight. Now, the article does admit that there's maybe something there where they say, it's hard to read on my screen, but you can probably date it back to 65, because they realize that dinos, but that's the headline comes up, 55 million years. So if we look at the progression of the flood, what we see in the lowest level, which is called the Cambrian layer on top of the Precambrian rock, are all mainly bottom-dwelling creatures that lived on the bottom. Well, you'd expect that. As the sediment's washing off, they're getting covered and inundated. And then as the flood progresses, more and more swimming creatures and other forms of life that are on the edges of the shores, they start getting fossilized. And then land-based creatures start appearing because the waters are rising up onto the land. And then the slow-moving creatures like tortoises and things like that, they eventually get caught by the rising water. And then finally, the fastest moving creatures, like horses and humans and so on, can flee inland, and then eventually they end up in the fossil record. And so what you have is, in the lowest level, mostly sea-bound life. At the highest levels, mostly land-based life. The flood explains it quite well, what you actually find in the fossil records. And the out-of-place fossils are not a problem, because if a bird got washed into the lowest level, not a problem, because it's all occurring during the flood. And so the best explanation for the sediment layers and what you find in them is the flood. So then there's objections. Well, the animals couldn't reach the ark. Well, how did the animals get from Australia? But there wasn't an Australia before the flood. There was a single continent, and there you see South America, Brazil and Africa aligned, and there you see North America and Greenland and Europe aligned. So those sediment layers were laid down. This continent then breaks up during the late stages of the flood. So the verse I'm quoting here, Genesis 1, is that God created the land as a single entity. So another objection is the ark is not large enough to hold all the animals. This is what people typically think of as the ark. So big giant dino like this, could it have fit in the ark? Well, if we take it to scale, it could have fit in the ark. But God would not have sent the big old crotchety dinosaur to go into the ark. He would have sent the young fertile pair. He also wouldn't have sent the biggest dinosaur on the earth, because woolly mammoths, just as an example, elephants, eat between 200 and 300 kilos of food a day. Well, that dino probably would have eaten 1,000 kilos of food a day. So God would have sent a young pair, and also Noah would have gotten tired of shoveling all the poop. So there's a lot of reasons God sent young animals. What about this one? We all know this creature, the T-Rex, twice as tall as an African elephant. When reduced to scale, you can hardly see it in the ark. So there's not a problem with these animals fitting in the ark. And this demonstrates the accuracy of the instructions that God gave to Noah to build the ark. What about all of the species that would be there? So the ark could have carried, based upon its carrying capacity, 100,000 pairs of the average size of animal, 100,000 pairs. But probably fewer than 10,000 kinds needed to be accommodated of birds and land-based creatures based on kinds. So I should back up for a second. So God didn't send 2 zebras, 2 horses, and 2 donkeys. He sent 2 equine kinds. He didn't send 2 tigers, 2 lions, and 2 lynxes, and 2 bobcats. He sent 2 feline kinds, and similarly with canine kinds. 2 kinds, and then they speciated after they came out of the ark. The ark isn't large enough to hold all the animal kinds, but God tells us that he sent them. Another thing is Noah couldn't have fed all the animals. So one possibility is that a lot of them hibernated. But they did have over 100 years warning, and they probably built the ark over about 90 years, and they were able to outfit it with a lot of food as well. But they could have hibernated. So people say, well, a local flood was what it was. But we're told that all the mountains were covered with 15 cubits of water. If it were local, if the highest mountains were covered with water, water seeks its own level, and so everything was covered. No ark would have been needed if it was a local flood. Noah was given a 120-year warning about the flood, and he could have literally walked around the earth long before the flood came. The animals didn't need to come to Noah. Why send the animals? Just tell them to avoid the local flood. And we're told that every human being on earth was killed in the flood. So it had to have been a global, people were spread around the continent. Noah and his family were the only survivors, and this is repeated multiple times in Scripture. And so then there's an objection, well, where did God put all the water from the flood? And we have, geologists have what's called CPT, catastrophic plate tectonics. And there's an explanation that the continents are floating up and the sea levels are going down below. And so we're getting, or the bottom of the oceans are going down below and the continents are floating on magma. And so this is creating new oceans that are much deeper than the original sea before the flood to absorb all that water, new ocean basins. We also have during the flood rapid mountain building. The Himalayas were not the mountains before the flood. They were lower before the flood. But the Himalayas were not formed over millions of years. They were formed at the end of the flood when the continent is breaking up and the Indian subcontinent smashes into Asia, and the sediment layers are still soft, and they force mountain building up. And at the top of the Himalaya mountains, there are sediment layers with fossils in them, which indicates that they were buried during the flood and forced up after the end of the flood. And here's an interesting one. In the Andes in South America, studies have been done, and recently the mountain has risen 6 feet in 8 years. The Andes have been going up 6 feet in 8 years. And people would say, why did they build Machu Picchu so high up where it's hard to breathe? They didn't. It was way down. And the mountains have been still lifting since the flood and going up rapidly. Another objection is after the flood, animals couldn't have migrated like to Australia. They would have had trouble. Well, during the flood, immediately after the flood, the Ice Age commenced. And a lot of water ended up on continent-wide glaciers that covered all of Canada, except a little bit on the coast. Certainly all of Manitoba and all of Ontario were completely covered by the glaciers. And massive quantities of water were being stored in mountain glaciers and in European glaciers, not as extensive as the North American. And so the sea level, immediately after the flood, the water was draining down, and then water was going into the ice, and people built along the shores at a sea level that was lower than today. And if you take the water that was in the North American glacier and put it back into the glacier and in the European glaciers, continental glaciers, you actually lower the sea level to the extent that there's an actual land bridge between Russia and Alaska. And you can also get, you see the red on the, is walking land area, so you can walk from Borneo almost to Australia, and there's just little channels that you have to cross. When you just take the water that was in the continental glaciers and remove it from the oceans, you actually lower the sea level. And there's all kinds, so when the migration came from Shinar, they were coming across while the Ice Age was going on, and I read you the Lene Lappi account. They walked on ice, and they're coming across, and there's a land bridge and through the Bering Strait. Another thing is that our creationist model indicated that they would float on massive land rafts, plant rafts that were left over from the flood. A lot of organic material hadn't yet decayed, and the animals coming out of the ark would have floated. We proposed this, and it was sort of ridiculed. Now recently, they're accepting this idea that you can float on, animals can repopulate after hurricanes and stuff by floating on plant rafts. And that was in the New Scientist. So for every objection they may come up with the flood, there are very reasonable explanations. And so in our Creation's Answer book, we have some of the questions related to the flood, all kinds of stuff. A lot of material by Michael Ord is on there. Tremendous stuff. He's a geologist and a climatologist. But if you start with the presupposition that there was a worldwide flood, you can make absolute sense out of all of the scientific data collected about the sedimentary rock, out-of-place fossils, the sediment layers that are around the world. But if you reject a worldwide flood, you end up with all kinds of inconsistencies and conundrum. I showed you the examples of when grass is supposed to have evolved, and yet it's in dino stomachs and that kind of stuff. The New Testament writers tell us that there was a flood. For instance, Jesus speaking and Matthew records it, for in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking and marrying. So Jesus assumes a flood, and he says that they were continuing to do as Noah built the ark until the flood came. So Jesus says there was a flood. And Peter tells us they deliberately forget that long ago by God's word, the heavens existed and the earth was formed out of water and by water. And by these waters also, the world at that time was deluged and destroyed. So Peter declares that. And by faith, Noah, when he was warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. So the New Testament accepts the flood. And the only consistent way to deny the worldwide flood is to deny that Genesis teaches history, to claim that Jesus and Peter and the writer of Hebrews were naive. But the Bible describes a worldwide flood that destroyed all land-based life. And the best explanation for the geological formations that we have today is the flood. So I have one of these Noah's Ark feasibility study, how Noah's flood shaped our earth. I've sold those DVDs, but you can get it, and then you can get the information. Flood by Design, there should be some copies out there. Biblical Geology, there's a children's book on Noah's Ark. Of course, you can subscribe to Creation Magazine. And recently we had an episode on Noah's Ark, a feasibility study on our Creation Magazine Live. And don't forget to subscribe. So, there's the flood. So how are we doing? So we can take a few questions if you want. Can we pass the microphone around if a person... Doesn't have to be about the flood, but if you have any questions, we can take a few questions.
All right. Anybody have a question? I'll bring the mic over. Just lift your hand, raise your hand.
I'm wondering what your answer is to the idea that between Genesis 1 verse 1 and 1 verse 2 is a big gap of time.
Yeah, the gap theory. So I mentioned in the first presentation that there's a lot of alternate views that are applied to Genesis 1. We certainly don't hold to that view. We hold that it's a sequence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, so there was space, time, energy, and matter. He said, let there be light. It's just continuous flow. We do not hold to the gap theory, and it's an attempt to wedge evolution, or it's actually an attempt to wedge in deep time into, so that you can account for why we can see starlight from stars that are millions of light years away. It's really an attempt to try to wedge deep time in. It's not the way to deal with it.
I think you made a comment before saying that you thought it was a mature world was created. Is that correct?
Yes.
So all the fossils could have had the look of 1,000,000 years old.
The fossils?
Yeah.
But see the point when I did that thing about the evidence for Adam's sin. Death is the result of Adam's sin. God didn't create fossils in situ. The best evidence for fossils is the flood, because the fossils indicate there was carnivorism, cancer, and decay, and death. And so that's not something good that God created.
So no fossils are more than 6,000 years old.
Sorry?
No fossils are more than 6,000 years old.
Right. Correct. That is correct. None of them are more than 6,000 years old because they all are the result of Adam's sin. That's the vestige of sin. Now, God did create a mature world, though. Adam was created as an adult. Trees had fruit with seed already in them. Rivers were flowing out of Eden, and so there was a valley or a course for the river. There was soil to hold up trees. It was a mature world. It had an apparent age, but there was no death, no decay, no sin, but it had an apparent age. Any other questions?
Got a question here. Can you pinpoint, or is it possible to pinpoint where the ark is?
I said at the beginning of my presentation I wouldn't deal with the search for Noah's Ark. I have read a lot on it, and I flip back and forth on it. If the ark was found, it certainly wouldn't hurt our position, but I don't think it's going to be found. So all we're told was somewhere on the mountains of Ararat, not necessarily on Ararat. And there's all kinds of supposition about where it landed. But it was in the general area of eastern Turkey. And then they migrated down into the Mesopotamian valley into Shinar. But beyond that, I have no idea. And I know there's lots of theories, and people have said they've spotted it from the air and expeditions, but it strikes me somewhat as the search for a Loch Ness monster. But
How much languages existed before the Tower of Babel?
one,
Okay.
everybody had a common language. But if I can take a little segue, I don't quote me on this necessarily, but I believe that when God confused the languages, every single person had a unique language. And it shouldn't surprise you because there's over 6,000 languages in the world today. And God could easily have given every inhabitant of the earth at the time of the Tower of Babel a unique language. So it wasn't just every husband and wife and child could not communicate with one another. It was absolute chaos. But eventually, the family would learn one of the languages and they'd start to cooperate again. But that's just a theory from my point. I don't have any written documentation on that. Where?
Over here, sorry.
Oh, yeah, there you are, yes.
How long do you think, or like how long did the Ice Age last? How long do you
So the Ice Age, to reach maximum glaciation, was roughly 500 years. It started the first winter after the flood, and peak glaciation occurred after about 500 years, and then it took another 200 years for it to melt off. So flood was roughly 2400 BC, so you're going down 700 years, so you're going down to what? You take off 400 years and 300 years, so you're going down to roughly 1700 BC. Abraham is roughly around 2000 BC, so Abraham was living when the Ice Age was receding. Job is probably 200 years before Abraham, and he's probably the Jobab that's mentioned in Genesis 11. And people say, well, Jobab is not necessarily Job. I'm Jim and I'm James. You know, people have multiple names, right? So it's probably and based on that, and the book of Job is the oldest book in the Bible. The book of Job is very interesting because more references to snow and sleet and hail and cold weather, and it even talks about the ocean being frozen in the book of Job. And so It was written in around 2200 BC, and the Ice Age was at its peak when he wrote. Now, they were far enough south that they didn't get the full impact of the Ice Age because they were lower down. But Abraham is while the recession is occurring. And I again, don't quote me necessarily on this, but there may be a connection with the plagues, not the plagues, the famine at the time of Joseph. You remember the 7 years of famine? And that may be at the end of the Ice Age. That you might be able to tie that in.
So in Genesis 1 verse 6, it refers to how God separated the waters. And in the German Bible specifically, it sounds like a hard surface of water above. Why are you not referring to that one as part of?
So this is what's called the vapor canopy theory. And our scientists have said that they've rejected the vapor canopy theory because if you had that much water in the atmosphere, it's interesting. People talk about carbon dioxide being a greenhouse gas. It isn't. Water vapor is the greenhouse gas. And when you have a lot of water vapor, the earth heats up. And if you had a huge amount of water in the atmosphere, the earth would have been so hot we couldn't have lived. So the physics of it do not accept it as being... Russell Humphreys, one of our physicists, you can read his material on our website. He explains about the water above the heavens and the water below. And he's got an interesting model. In fact, the latest issue of Journal of Creation, he writes about it. I don't know if the article's available on our website yet, but one of the scientists at the Institute for Creation Research, he actually quoted from Russell Humphreys' article from the latest issue of the Journal of Creation, dealing with that water above the firmament and below. So we'd have to get into some complex physics, and Russell Humphreys is a physicist. But we don't accept the vapor canopy view. And there's just, physics become way too complicated if you have this massive amount of water in the air. And I know that was originally what people thought where all the water came from for the flood, but it really is a better explanation coming from the fountains of the deep. The hot water goes up as vapor, and then as it hits the cold atmosphere, it comes down as rain. That's a far simpler explanation. And it's consistent with Scripture, because it's there, the fountains of the deep.